Greetings, Poe fans from around the world. Welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe Birthday Celebration, a virtual and live event being held in Baltimore, a tradition since 1982. Normally, we would be celebrating this at the Poe grave, but due to the pandemic, this event is virtual with a birthday toast to Poe broadcast live at 5 p.m. at his grave. Please be there. My name is Jeff Jerome, Curator Emeritus, and I'm your host for this beautiful birthday tribute to Poe, and welcome to Act 4 of 6 acts. Featuring historic locations in Baltimore and Richmond, Virginia, each act is Poe-related, featuring stories, poems, recollections, and discussions about his life and works. It was really difficult putting this together with the current events, but it was worth it because you are worth it. Today, right now, thousands of people from around the world are joining us and helping us celebrate Edgar's 212th birthday in the comfort of their homes or crypts. It is my distinct honor to bring this celebration to you. Today, we are speaking with Mr. David Galen. He is president of the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore and author of Edgar Allan Poe's Baltimore, the book right here, and soon to be published, The Final Days of Edgar Allan Poe, which is an in-depth examination of Poe's death, which is sort of what we will be talking about today. Maybe we'll solve the riddle of Poe's death. We'll see. David, welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe Birthday Celebration. I'm so happy to have someone like you join this celebration.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm glad to be here.
That's great. And you know, I've been at the Poe House for many, many years. I'm no longer there. I'm retired from the Poe House. But it seemed like the number one question that people would ask, and I see this all the time on the internet, on Poe pages, people want to know, what did Poe die from? The second question was, is Poe really crazy? But that's a topic for another program. So how did Edgar Allan Poe die? Now, you prepared over 40, count them, 40 different theories about Poe's death. And it seems like every year there's a new one, just as silly, just as stupid as the previous one. Now, why don't you start off and just tell us, what was Poe doing in Baltimore? How did he get here?
Well, Poe was on his way to New York, actually. He spent the previous 2 or 3 months in Richmond, and was going to reestablish himself there. And at the time, he was on his way back to New York to collect his belongings and his mother-in-law, his aunt, Maria Clem, and restore her to Richmond along with himself for a wedding they had planned down there.
To his childhood sweetheart.
To his childhood sweetheart.
Oh, that's lovely, isn't it? After all those years, they reunited. And
it is.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so he's originally he intended just to make a train connection, a travel connection in Baltimore. And we really don't know if he changed his plans. From the surviving correspondence, we know that he originally intended to just pass through Baltimore.
Well, you know, and this really annoys me. I see this a lot in articles about Poe. They say, no one knows why Poe was in Baltimore. He just showed up. Well, we know why he was in Baltimore. He went from Richmond to Baltimore, supposed to go to Philadelphia, then end up in New York. So there's no mystery why Poe was in Baltimore.
No, there's no mystery why he was in Baltimore. But he was found after a period of a couple of days, maybe a period as long as 5 days, at a tavern in East Baltimore. And how he ended up there and his reasons for going there, if they were his own, we just don't know.
What was the name of the place?
The tavern was Gunner's Hall. It was on the bottom floor of the Fourth Ward Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually a political clubhouse used by the Whigs at that time. He was found on election day, and public houses were used at that time for voting locations, poll locations.
Of course.
Because there was a shortage of public buildings, civic buildings. And he was found there. during election day, which caused a lot of people to believe that maybe he was the victim of a political kidnapping, which a practice was called cooping at the time.
Well, that's one of the many theories concerning his death, and that's the one that I lean towards. And for those of you that have never heard of the term cooping, it was a practice that if you were running for office and you were dishonest, and thank goodness we don't have that problem now, dishonest politicians, I tell you. But if you're running for office and you were dishonest, you would hire the police or thugs. They would go out and basically kidnap people, coop them up in the basement of a building, and use them as repeat voters. Now, in order to keep the people that were cooped quiet, they would ply you with alcohol or opium. And once you were quiet, they would put all of you in a wagon, and they would go to the different precincts and vote for the same person.
It was an effective way of ballot stuffing. By changing their identities, one person could vote as many as 6 or 8 times during the daytime.
Well, what they would do is they would make a very poor attempt at disguising you. Now, in order for this scheme to work, the election judge had to be in on it, but you really wanted to insulate him from this. So if the person that you cooped had a beard, maybe you would shave it off, or a mustache, maybe you would shave it off. Or the easiest thing to do would be to change your clothing. And that way the election judge could say, I never saw that guy before, he can vote, knowing full well that he has already been voted numerous times. So they would make the rounds and make the rounds and make the rounds. And when you got to a point where you couldn't even vote, or maybe you started fighting, you passed out, they would dump you out on the street. This was a very vicious practice, but all cities did it, not just Baltimore.
Other cities did it, but Baltimore was the most notorious for it. Because of the explosive growth of the city, the police force didn't keep pace. And law enforcement was inadequate at the time. There was no...
basically useless.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but there was not like this today, and there was no patrols. Law enforcement back then consisted of a series of watch houses. The police stayed in their watch houses, and they didn't want to be bothered. When they heard about riots at the polls or physical violence at the polls, they told the people, take your complaint to City Hall. They just didn't want to be bothered.
Well, you know, in a way you can't blame them, but basically they really didn't help. They really, like you said, didn't want to get involved. So tell our audience, who found Poe? I mean, how, was he walking down the street? What happened?
He was recognized by a typesetter that he had worked with or had some dealings with when he was in Baltimore prior to this. It was raining that day, pretty steady. So somebody seeing him on the street probably would not have recognized him in the downpour. And certainly if they did, they wouldn't want to socialize him when out in the weather. He was first discovered inside Governor's Hall, sitting in an armchair.
Now, whoa, wait a minute. I always thought he was found in the gutter.
That's been the tradition, but there's no evidence to support that. And there's nothing to support that he was even found outside. Walker, who sent his note to a colleague to come help him, indicates that he was at Governor's Hall. It does not say in the note that he was in front of Governor's Hall or outside Governor's Hall. The note says he was at Governor's Hall. And when Snodgrass, his colleague, actually came and showed up to help Walker, he found him sitting in an armchair. And
that really, it always irritates me when I read that he was found in the gutter. And I guess it sounds good, or found in the street, but that's one myth about Poe that I think we'll never ever be able to put down. I do my best, and I know you do also, but it's sort of like, we're going to be long gone, and people will still be saying, I found him in the gutter, so.
Or on a park bench.
Park bench, exactly. So they found Poe wearing someone else's clothing, mismatched, soiled, and ripped inside a tavern. and Dr. Snodgrass, who lived in the area, was the person that was summoned, and take it up from there.
Well, Snodgrass saw the seriousness of his condition and thought that it best that he remove him from the tavern environment and tried to make arrangements for a room upstairs. On his way back down, his uncle, Henry Herring, showed up and overruled Snodgrass, deciding instead that he should go to the hospital. Snodgrass suggested that, why don't you just take him to your house? In which Herring replied that he was, in the past, he'd been abusive to his family, and he just didn't want to do that again.
Henry Herring didn't like Poe. Is that a fair statement?
That's pretty accurate. Poe, when he would come to visit in Baltimore, he always stayed at the Herring's house, but that apparently he wore out his welcome there. Something transpired, and there was some animosity between the Herrings and Edgar Allan Poe by that time.
So Mr. Herring said, "Not in my house," and that's when they said, "Take him to the nearest hospital."
Take him to the nearest hospital. And he was, in Snodgrass's words, he was beyond locomotion. They had to pick him up as though he was a corpse, and he shuffled him into a taxi cab. It's important to remember here that he went to the hospital unaccompanied. The tradition is that they went to the hospital with him, but the evidence seems to suggest that he arrived at the hospital by himself, and that his identity was not successfully communicated to the hospital staff. They didn't know who he was at first. They thought he was just another homeless inebriate, so they dumped him on the fourth floor ward in the drunk tank. At first.
Yeah. So, jumping ahead, he's there several days, in and out of delirium. Sometimes he's lucid, sometimes he's not. There's one story that he was calling out for Reynolds. We don't even know if that's accurate or not.
We don't know for sure. Moran puts that in his letter to Maria Clem when she asked about the circumstances under which Poe died. Dr. Moran was his assisting physician, his presiding doctor at the hospital. He wrote to his aunt saying that that was one of the things that he did. He was delirious and he was calling out the name Reynolds. He may not have heard it himself because the letter appears to be a transcription of a case report that he was writing from. As administrator of the hospital, he probably didn't have much time for individual patients, so he relied on stewards and apprentices and interns to care for Poe.
Now, of course, after Poe's death, Poe became famous. Dr. Moran probably thought, hey, there might be some gain for me, saying that I was the doctor that treated Edgar Allan Poe. And at that point, he started going on a lecture circuit talking about Poe's death, and it seemed like, depending upon the audience, the story would change.
Well, he went on a lecture circuit much later in his career. He first wrote an article that appeared in the New York Herald in 1875, a very lengthy article about the circumstances of Poe's death, in which Poe delivered this soliloquy, this speech that was just fantastic, and he gave questionable details before what happened to Poe before and after, and that's what started. That's what pointed a big arrow at Dr. Moran. That's how he got his first notice in that newspaper article.
Right.
And then later he went on the lecture tour.
So October 7th, 5 a.m. in the morning, Poe finally dies. And what happens next? Poe's dead.
Well, by this time, they definitely knew who they had in the hospital. They definitely had identified.
And more relatives became involved.
Well, there's evidence. His cousin Nelson Poe claims that he tried to visit Poe twice. Even if he was unsuccessful in visiting Poe, his calling at the hospital they would have been obligated to find out who he's trying to see, who they had, and where he was in the building. And at that point, I think they realized who they had there.
Yeah.
But we don't know. Nelson Poe was involved in a heavy legal case during that week. He was preoccupied in the defense of a fellow that was accused of assault, and he had to stay at the behest of the court because the jury had to trial.
Right. So he just couldn't say, "I'll be back in 15 minutes. I want to go check on someone." It didn't work out that way.
So he didn't have a lot of time to visit Poe.
Yeah.
But I'm convinced that he tried and showed up at the hospital at least one time.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Now, we talked about cooping, and I also mentioned 40 other theories concerning Poe's death. Another one that is a popular theory is that he died from rabies, and that was because of a 1995 medical report. It was a blind study, meaning that this doctor and his students received patient X medical report, and it was their job to find out what the person died from. And this group came up with rabies, and they didn't know they were talking about or discussing Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I met Dr. Benitez, and even he said that it's just a theory. And the problem I have with the rabies theories is that the original doctor that gathered the basic information and then gave it to Dr. Benitez and the students, that information was incomplete and flawed. So they were working with the wrong information.
That's correct. They had read Moran's book, in which he said that initially he said that Poe refused any liquids at all. He wouldn't drink water. So, and they took that to mean that Poe was suffering from hydrophobia. But later in the report, later in the book, Moran clearly states that he gave him beef tea, and he took water with no problem whatsoever. So it looks like they were very selective with their
That's what it sounds like. Incidentally, what is beef tea? Do you know?
Honestly, I've never had it.
Is it like beef
It's
broth?
It's broth. It's like a soup.
And tea is mixed in with it, maybe?
I've never had it, but I've always assumed that it was like a soup broth.
Yeah. So I guess it had nutrients, and it was something easy you could give the patient. Yeah. So rabies. Do you have another favorite? Delirium Tremens.
The overwhelming evidence is that Poe suffered from delirium tremens, or a combination of other maladies that delirium tremens agitated. But he had a history of drinking by that time. He had drinking binges as well. And we know that in Philadelphia, on his way down on that last trip, he suffered an attack of delirium tremens. By his own admission, he did. And there was probably 2 episodes in Richmond before he came north. It seems that was probably one of the reasons, one of the causes of his death.
I think cooping, I think certainly did him in, but I think it was a combination of events, like a perfect storm. We know that when he left Richmond, he had a fever. His fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, was concerned about him because of the fever, but unfortunately she tried to stop him, but he already boarded the boat and came to Baltimore. So we know that he was sick when he came to Baltimore, but we still can't explain those several days where he just vanished. So cooping, I think that when the Coopers got him, if that's what happened, he was already in bad shape.
That's accurate.
And the abuse that he suffered, giving him alcohol, opium, if they did that to calm him down, I think that was just way too much. And also, in that time period, at hospitals, they would frequently use opium to calm people down. They would also use alcohol. So it's possible that Dr. Moran, without realizing it, contributed to Poe's death by using what he thought was standard medical procedures for that time period?
Of course. I've been asked why there was no autopsy performed.
I hear that a lot too.
And the reason for that is the people at the hospital were convinced they knew what the cause of death was. There was no reason to perform a post-mortem examination, especially if you had to pay for it, if the facility had to pay for it. And if the family was satisfied with the cause of death, which they would have had to order an autopsy to begin with. If they were satisfied, there was no reason for one.
And I don't know, I'm not a doctor, you're not a doctor, of course, but I don't know in that time period what they really could find out about an autopsy.
Autopsies then were in a primitive stage. There was no protocols. There was very little standardization. It was a haphazard practice. Sometimes you got lucky and you found out what the actual cause of death was.
Yeah. So everyone was happy with, well, I shouldn't say happy, everyone was satisfied
At the hospital
with the cause of death. Nielsen Poe, it was like, oh yeah, that's what happened to him. Why go any further with it?
Right. The people creating the mystery actually of Poe's death, and the people that were asking for an autopsy were people that weren't there. They came along later, and that's when the mystery of Poe's death was really created.
Yeah. So I don't, I said, we're going to attempt to solve the riddle of Poe's death, and I don't think we can. We can go over all these theories and punch holes in them, and the truth is, we can't assume that, oh, it was cooking that may have contributed to it, or it was alcohol abuse, or that it was cholera, or maybe a combination of all these things that happened to Poe. But I think it's unfair to assume that Poe got drunk and passed out and that's what did him in. Alcohol may have figured in his death, but in my humble opinion, I don't think he got drunk and just went on a binge. I think something happened to him beyond his control, and he died.
Well, whether he was drunk or whether he was suffering from alcohol withdrawal, the question becomes, did he do it to himself, or was it forced upon him by someone else?
The plot thickens. And really, you have 40 theories right here. I suspect in maybe 2-3 years, this will grow to 60 theories. Everyone that has a pet theory will come out and say, oh, Poe died from this or that because of this or that. And if anything, I think the good thing about this is it generates discussions about Poe's life. And even though we have all these stupid myths about Poe, they do generate questions, discussions about Poe. Now let's leave Poe's death for a moment. This is your first book, which is, people can buy this. I believe it's on Amazon. Yeah.
Amazon.
Tell the audience briefly, what is this book?
Well, this is a book for a picture book, an illustrated version, illustrated series of picture books that Arcadia Publishing put out for different cities and different regions around the country. Richmond had one on Poe. There was Chris Senford did one for Poe in Richmond, and after I saw that, I realized there were 4 books on Poe in Richmond and not one of him in Baltimore. So I approached Arcadia and asked them if they wanted a companion book to the Richmond book, and they went for it.
Well, see, this is what I was talking about before. It's researchers like you that, without fanfare, you're not running down the street holding a banner, I'm a Poe scholar. You do this quiet research and you come across and you publish the only book that I'm aware of where it talks about Poe in Baltimore. So far. And I think this is an excellent book, not because there's a picture of me inside of it, but it really covers a lot of details in one book. You don't have to go looking through several different books to find all this information. And
it can serve as a guide for people that want to see the sites in Baltimore that are associated with Poe. they can get the book and use it as a guide to travel around the city and see all these sites where Poe visited, where he lived, and where he died.
Exactly. Now, briefly tell our worldwide audience what you're working on now. What's your next book about?
This book is about the final days of Edgar Allan Poe. It starts with him in Richmond, and it details everything that transpired up until his death. And there's even an epilogue chapter that covers the burial as well. But it's an in-depth examination. Up until now, there hasn't really been an objective exploration of his death. I mean, there's been a couple of chapters in some of the more exhaustive biographies, and there's been a couple of novels written with people had pet theories, but there hasn't been an objective look at his death.
Well, the key word is objective. And there are so many biographies out there that are slanted towards the biases of the person writing the book. And, you know, that's fine. But if you don't like Edgar Allan Poe and you write a biography about him, you can sure bet that book is going to be slanted towards Poe in a very negative way.
Yeah, that's true.
So, again, I have to admire you because, you know, you do this research, you're serving a real purpose. You are giving the world all this information about Poe objectively. It's not slanted, you're not biased, and I really...
Well, it's hard to keep observations when you do, you know, a biography. It's hard to keep your observations. And I try to isolate them in the notes of the book and not in the actual manuscript.
There you go. Well, David, this has been delightful. I'm really pleased that you could join us. And if anything, those of you listening to this, it would encourage you to do more research and keep an open mind. Don't go to one biography and say, okay, this is it. I know all there is about Edgar Allan Poe. I've been studying Edgar Allan Poe for 35 some years, and I can't say I know all there is to know about Poe. It's always something new. Every time I talk to a Poe scholar, I get a different viewpoint. And I know you and I have talked about Poe's death several times. And even though we might not see eye to eye, it's a good discussion. And I hope that those of you that are listening, do the research and keep an open mind. So thank you, David. Again, I'm Jeff Jerome, thanking David, the H.L. Mencken House for allowing us the use of this site for the birthday celebration, and the crew behind the scenes, the people working the lights and the cameras. Thank you for joining us. Now, at 4 p.m., we'll see you at the Annabel Lee Tavern for our next performance, For the Moon Never Beams. And we have something quite special to share with our audience at the Annabel Lee Tavern. So this has been great meeting with you again, and I hope you have been enjoying the birthday celebration. And remember, join us at the Poe grave live at 5 p.m.